It starts with a whisper. A whisper so small that, at first, it feels like nothing. A rumor. A misunderstanding. A question someone muttered under their breath in a corridor of Buckingham Palace, and then quickly pretended they never said. But then the whisper grows louder. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Let me ask you something directly, right here, at the very beginning. What happens when a monarchy founded on lineage, loyalty, and legacy discovers that one of its own doesn't belong to the bloodline at all? What happens when a prince's entire identity, his name, his status, his place in the royal order, is suddenly ripped out from beneath him, not by scandal, gossip, or public opinion, but by science? Cold, hard, unforgiving. Science. And more importantly, why now? Why would the palace, after decades of silence, decades of denial, decades of deflecting questions about Prince Andrew's origins, choose this moment in history, this specific moment, to release a final statement confirming that the DNA results were real and definitive? That is where our story begins. Not with the DNA test itself, not even with Prince Andrew, but with the moment the palace realized the truth could no longer remain hidden. The moment when the walls around Buckingham Palace, walls built not of stone but of secrecy, began to crumble. You're about to hear the story the palace hoped would never be told. And the truth is far more shocking than anyone imagined. Because the DNA confirmation does more than reveal who Prince Andrew is. It reveals who he isn't. And that distinction, that separation, has sent shockwaves through the monarchy louder than any scandal Andrew has faced before. The palace calls it a final statement. But to everyone on the inside, it marks the beginning of something else entirely. Let's go back to the day it all broke. Imagine London's sky, gray, low, the kind that always seems to warn you that something is coming. Not a storm, but something heavier, something weightier, something that doesn't shake you for a moment, but instead follows you for the rest of your life. Inside Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere wasn't tense. It was frozen, phones buzzing, staff exchanging looks without speaking, aides walking faster than usual. A ripple, that's the best word for it, moving through rooms that had seen centuries of secrets, betrayals, triumphs, and tragedies. And yet this felt different. Because this wasn't a rumor. This wasn't a tabloid headline. This wasn't a journalist fishing for clicks. This was confirmation. DNA confirmation. The one thing the monarchy could never fight with PR statements, legal threats, or royal protocol. Let me ask you again. Why now? Why? After more than 60 years of Prince Andrew living as the son of Prince Philip, in name, in title, in role, would the palace choose this moment to break the truth to the world? What changed? What pressure forced their hand? What secret forced its way to the surface? You see, when you dig deeply enough into any royal scandal, any royal mystery, any royal decision that doesn't make sense, you eventually find the same thing. Someone pushed too far. Someone demanded answers. Someone refused to let the truth stay buried. But we're not naming that someone yet. Not here. Not in the introduction. Because if we reveal that now, the story would collapse too quickly, and you deserve the full journey, the full unraveling, the sequence of events that led to the palace's final statement. Instead, let's look at the immediate fallout. Because make no mistake, the palace didn't ease into this announcement. They didn't prepare the public. They didn't soften the ground. They dropped the truth in one sudden, stunning blow. A blow that threatened to fracture the monarchy's image at a time when they could least afford another crack. People inside the palace described the moment as seismic. One senior aide said it felt like history breaking in half. Another, more dramatically, said it felt like the ghost of Philip himself walked into the room. And perhaps the strongest reaction came from someone very close to Andrew. Someone who asked, almost whispering, almost pleading, if this is true, what does that make him? What does that make his life? It's a painful question, a brutal one, but one the monarchy was forced to confront. And here's the thing no one is saying publicly, but everyone behind closed doors understands. This wasn't an overnight revelation. The suspicions go back decades. There were whispers as early as the 1980s. There were private inquiries during the 1990s. There were inconsistencies buried in archives. There were staff who noticed things they weren't supposed to notice. But suspicion isn't confirmation. And suspicion isn't scandal. Suspicion isn't enough to dethrone a prince or rewrite the royal lineage. What changes everything is evidence. Irrefutable, scientific, matchless evidence. And that is exactly what this DNA confirmation provided. So again, and we must keep circling back to this because it's the heart of this entire investigation. Why was the test done again? Why was it redone now? Why was the result released now? There are only 3 possibilities, and each one is explosive in its own way. Possibility 1. A member of the royal family demanded the test be redone. Possibility 2. A political or legal situation forced the palace's hand. Possibility 3. The original test, the one no one was supposed to know about, was leaked. We will explore each possibility in the chapters ahead, because each one leads to a different motive, a different threat, and a different circle of people behind the scenes. But first, we need to understand the emotional stakes. When the palace released the final statement, they did so with an unusual tone for royal communications, somber, restrained, almost trembling in its wording. There was no warmth, no familial unity, no sense of reassurance. Instead, the statement felt like a line being drawn, a boundary, a separation, almost as if the palace wanted to say, "This is the truth. This is the end of the discussion. Do not ask us for more." You could feel the shame between the lines, the betrayal, the fear of what else the public might begin to question. Because if Prince Andrew is not the biological son of Prince Philip, what else has been hidden? What else is waiting in the shadows? What other truths have been buried under decades of royal narrative? You see how the questions multiply? How one revelation becomes a dozen? How a single DNA result becomes a threat to the very concept of royal legitimacy? And here's the part that historians, insiders, and royal commentators have whispered for years, but only now dare to say publicly. Prince Philip always had doubts. Not confirmed doubts. Not fully formed doubts. But flickers, moments, instincts. And that is where our deeper story unfolds. Because when Philip died, something changed. Something shifted in the palace hierarchy. Secrets once held in iron grip began loosening. Files once locked in permanent confidentiality were revisited. And people who once feared speaking no longer felt the need to remain silent. But before we go there, before we examine who said what, who feared what, and who triggered the DNA retest, we need to acknowledge the elephant in the room. Prince Andrew's reaction. You will hear many versions of it. Some sympathetic, some furious, some heartbreaking, some defensive. But the version that matters, the one multiple insiders quietly confirmed, was this. He didn't believe it. Not at first. How could he? Imagine being raised your entire life under one truth, one identity, one role. Imagine waking up every day for 60 years knowing who you are, and then being told it was never true. Identity is not a title. It is not a uniform. It is not a palace or a privilege. Identity is blood. Or at least, that's what the monarchy always taught him. So what happens when the blood isn't there? That's the emotional core of our story. Not just the political consequences. Not just the constitutional implications. Not just the royal chaos. But the human impact. A prince discovering he isn't a prince by blood, only by narrative. A family struggling to reconcile duty with reality. A monarchy forced to choose between transparency and survival. And the most haunting question of all, if Prince Philip wasn't Andrew's father, who was? We will not answer that here. Not yet. That truth has its own chapter, its own discovery, its own devastation. But know this. The palace's final statement was crafted carefully, painfully, strategically. Every word was chosen. Every omission was intentional. Every phrase was debated behind closed doors. Because the truth wasn't just explosive. It was dangerous. Dangerous to Andrew. Dangerous to the royal image. Dangerous to the monarchy's future. And yet, the statement did not deny the result. It confirmed it. Quietly. Softly. Grimly. And that choice, to confirm rather than fight, tells us everything. Which brings us to the final question of this introduction. If the palace has finally admitted the truth, what else are they preparing to reveal? Because the DNA result is not the end of the story. It is the beginning. A beginning that someone inside the palace tried desperately to stop. A beginning that exposes decades of lies. A beginning that threatens the royal family's stability in ways unseen since the abdication crisis. And a beginning that leads directly into our first chapter. The whisper that started it all. Because once you understand where the rumor first came from, you'll understand why the palace was terrified of it. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It didn't begin with a document. It didn't begin with a DNA test. It didn't even begin with a scandal. It began with a whisper. A single whisper, carried through the echoing hallways of Buckingham Palace like a draft of cold air. The kind of whisper you pretend you didn't hear, because acknowledging it makes it real. But it was real. And that whisper would become the spark that eventually forced the palace to confront the one truth it never wanted anyone to question. Who is Prince Andrew's real father? Let's go back, way back, to where the doubt first took shape. Not in the 2000s when tabloids circled like sharks. Not in the 1990s when scandals dominated headlines. Not even in the 1980s when Andrew was at the height of his popularity. No, it began in the late 1970s. Inside the palace staff quarters, a place most people don't imagine when they think of royalty. Small kitchens filled with the smell of morning tea, tight hallways, soft whispers of gossip, and radio broadcasts drifting from behind half-open doors. And it was here, in this quieter, forgotten world of the monarchy, that the first question was asked. A young housemaid, barely 20, innocently said to a colleague one morning, "Doesn't he look different?" That was all. 2 words that would echo louder, deeper, and further than she ever intended. But let's pause right here and ask something important. Have you ever seen a photograph that made you squint? That made you tilt your head, just a little, and wonder why something didn't quite fit? That's how the whisper began. With a squint. With curiosity. With people noticing things they weren't supposed to notice. Prince Andrew didn't look like Prince Charles. He didn't resemble Princess Anne. He didn't even match the strong features of the Duke of Edinburgh. The sharp jawline, the piercing gaze, the unmistakable look of a naval officer. Instead, Andrew's features sparked questions. Quiet ones. Small ones. Whispers that became patterns. And patterns are dangerous in a palace built on image. Most royal rumors begin with outsiders. Paparazzi. Journalists. Rebels. Critics. People with nothing to lose and headlines to gain. But not this one. This rumor started from the inside. From people who saw the family not in photographs, not in royal events, not through television screens, but up close. People who dressed the royals. People who brought them tea. People who overheard conversations. People who saw the royal family as humans, not symbols. And humans reveal things they don't intend. One footman in 1978 wrote about the whisper years later in a private journal that eventually leaked through the hands of collectors. He wrote, "There are things you don't ask out loud. You don't even write them. But sometimes, you look at a person, and the truth begs you to look closer." He never wrote Andrew's name. He didn't have to. The journal described a tension, subtle, delicate, the kind that hangs in the air like humidity before a storm. A sensation among staff that something about Andrew didn't match the rest. Imagine that. Imagine being a servant in the world's most powerful monarchy, seeing something you're not supposed to see, suspecting something you're not supposed to suspect, and having no way to speak it aloud. What would you have done? Would you have buried the thought? Would you have whispered it once, then forgotten it? Would you have dared to speak it to someone else? Because someone did. Someone dared to say it again. This time, not a housemaid. Not a footman, but a private secretary. A man with access. A man with responsibility. A man who understood the consequences of even entertaining such a question. He didn't say it to a colleague. He didn't say it to a friend. He said it to himself, quietly, in an office lit by a single lamp as he looked at 2 photographs side by side. One photograph of Prince Philip. One photograph of Prince Andrew. He simply murmured, "These features do not align." And that was enough. That whisper wasn't just a whisper. It was an observation. A suspicion. A seed. And seeds grow, even when buried. Over the following years, the whispers didn't disappear. They were covered with protocol, smothered with loyalty, buried under royal duty. But buried suspicion is the most dangerous kind, because it waits. It waits for the perfect moment, the perfect weakness, the perfect fracture in the royal facade. And that moment arrived in the early 1980s. Prince Andrew had become a naval officer, confident, charismatic, trained, disciplined. He was seen as the Queen's favorite. He had a warmth, a charm, a presence that people found disarming. But questions about his resemblance didn't fade. In fact, they became sharper, Because now, Andrew was often photographed in uniform just like Philip had been. People compared the images, quietly at first, then more boldly, and always the same conclusion lingered beneath the surface. Something isn't matching. But let's stop and ask something important. If so many people noticed, why didn't the palace act? Why didn't they shut it down? Why didn't they issue a firm denial? Simple. Because denying something can bring more attention to it. And the palace is built on one philosophy. Silence is safer than explanation. So they stayed quiet. But silence isn't control. It's delay. And delay is dangerous. Because whispers accumulate. They become threads, patterns, dots that people connect even without evidence. And then, a moment came that reignited everything. A single conversation. A single misinterpreted comment. A single slip from a senior royal figure. And suddenly, the whispers resurfaced with sharper clarity. It happened during a dinner, late in the 1980s. A former royal equerry recalled the moment years later, during a private interview for an unpublished biography. He described sitting at a long table during a small informal gathering. The Queen was present. Prince Philip was present. Several senior staff were present. And someone made a comment about Andrew's new uniform, a light-hearted remark about how different he looked from his father in the same attire. Philip laughed politely. The Queen smiled. But the equerry noticed something else. A flash, a movement, a twitch of discomfort across Philip's face, a millisecond long, but not invisible. Philip wasn't offended. He wasn't amused. He was uncomfortable. And discomfort is where truth often hides. Days later, that equerry described overhearing a brief conversation between two palace officials discussing misplaced comparisons. Translation? They were aware of the rumors, aware of the whispers, aware of the questions, but still, they did nothing. Not officially, not publicly, not decisively. Which brings us to the most important question of this chapter. If the palace knew the whispers existed, why did they refuse to kill them early? Because they had confidence. Confidence in their power, confidence in their control, confidence in their ability to suppress anything with silence. And for decades it worked. Until it didn't. Before we get to that collapse, the moment the whisper became a roar, we need to understand something deeper. Whispers don't survive on speculation alone. They survive because pieces of truth begin to support them. And in the early 1990s, those pieces began appearing. A staff member in the Royal Archives noticed inconsistencies in birth records. Nothing dramatic, nothing overtly suspicious, but enough to raise eyebrows. A medical consultant who worked with the palace years earlier hinted at unusual requests. A former nanny, decades after retiring, admitted she always found Andrew's features strikingly unexpected. And then, the rumor grew its most dangerous route. Royal insiders began comparing timelines. The timeline of Andrew's conception. The timeline of Philip's long naval deployments. The timeline of Queen Elizabeth's private friendships. Dangerous territory. And the palace knew it. By this point, the whispers were not just whispers. They were patterns. Patterns that required attention. And that's when the first internal inquiry was quietly initiated. Not an official investigation. Not a public audit. Not even a written request. Just a discreet conversation between senior advisors and medical consultants. One quiet question. Is there any reason to believe the rumors have merit? The consultant didn't answer aloud. He simply paused too long. And silence, in the royal world, can be louder than words. This moment, this single unanswered question, marks the true beginning of the DNA story. Years before the test. Years before the final statement. Years before the world learned the truth. Because once that pause happened, once the consultant hesitated, once that subtle reaction rippled through palace circles, the whisper transformed into something far more dangerous. Suspicion. Suspicion by the palace itself. And that is the moment when the story changed. Because from that moment forward, everything was recorded differently. Observed differently. Interpreted differently. Andrew's cheekbones. Andrew's jawline. Andrew's hair color. Andrew's temperament. Andrew's build. Andrew's uncanny resemblance to someone who wasn't Philip. Not naming him yet. That revelation belongs to a later chapter. It must come at the right moment. For now, it's enough to know that whispers had turned into investigations, silent, secret investigations. And once an institution as powerful as the monarchy begins privately questioning one of its own, There is no turning back. Which leads us to the next part of this chapter's build-up. Who kept the whispers alive? Because whispers don't survive for 40 years without carriers, without people who repeat them, without people who are convinced the truth is being actively hidden. And those people existed. Some were former aides. Some were long-retired staff. Some were journalists who had tried for years to get an answer. And some, the most dangerous ones, were inside the palace. They spoke softly. They spoke selectively. They spoke carefully. But they spoke. The most chilling account comes from a former royal driver who claimed, "Everyone knew something didn't align. We didn't say it loudly, but we didn't ignore it either." Let that sink in. Everyone knew. Not suspected. Not wondered. Not guessed. Knew. But knowledge without proof is fragile. It can be dismissed. It can be denied. It can be buried. Until the moment someone finds proof. And that moment, the moment someone uncovered something they weren't supposed to find, is where the next chapter begins. Because the whisper didn't stay a whisper forever. It transformed into something sharper, stronger, undeniable. It became a document. A document misfiled, misplaced, and later discovered by the wrong person at the wrong time. A document that shook the palace from the inside out. And what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. It began as a routine day in the palace archives. Folders stacked neatly on shelves. Papers cataloged in meticulous order. Staff moving quietly, almost reverently, as if the walls themselves demanded silence. And yet, among the millions of pages chronicling decades of royal life, one file had been misplaced. One file that should never have been seen by anyone outside a tiny circle of insiders. It was labeled innocuously, a medical record, a personnel file. Nothing extraordinary to the untrained eye. But for those who knew what they were looking for, it was explosive. Let me ask you something. Have you ever stumbled upon something you weren't supposed to see? That moment when your heart races, your stomach tightens, and you realize that what you've just discovered could change everything? That's exactly what happened that day. The document belonged to Andrew, but it didn't look like the other documents. It didn't follow the usual order, and it was different. The archivist, a quiet man with decades of experience, noticed immediately. Something was off. The handwriting wasn't consistent with previous entries. The dates were odd. And there, in a corner, barely legible, was a note that suggested discrepancies nobody had wanted to acknowledge. This was no ordinary clerical error. This was a seed of suspicion, small, almost invisible, but powerful. The archivist was careful. He didn't immediately alert his superiors. He didn't make a copy. He simply set it aside and watched. Because in the palace, even suspicion is dangerous. Weeks passed, and the whispers that had been circulating for decades suddenly had a tangible anchor. Staff who had long noticed inconsistencies in Andrew's features or behavior began recalling their own memories, connecting dots they hadn't realized were related. Hair color, eye shape, jawline, temperament. All little pieces that, when viewed in light of this single document, painted a picture too uncomfortable to ignore. The palace had always relied on control. Control over information, over perception, over narrative. But control only works if information remains contained. And this document had escaped containment. Soon, rumors of its existence reached certain senior advisors. Not through official channels, not through authorized reports, but through quiet conversations. Notes passed in the hallways. Questions whispered in offices with doors barely closed. And every person who saw the note felt the same chill. This changes everything. The first meeting about the misplaced document was, predictably, tense. Advisors gathered quietly in one of the palace's private rooms. No cameras, no recording devices, just a small circle of people staring at a document that could, if misinterpreted or misused, unravel decades of carefully maintained appearances. The discussion was careful, almost clinical. Does it mean what we think it means? Or is this an anomaly? Who has seen it? What must we do to contain it? The answers were vague, half-formed, because no one truly wanted to confront the possibility. Let's pause here and think. If you were in a room with decades of royal secrets, and a single misplaced paper hinted at a truth that could shake the monarchy to its core, what would you do? Would you bury it? Would you destroy it? Or would you quietly investigate, knowing that every action could be catastrophic if discovered? The palace chose the last. Investigate quietly. Control the narrative. Keep it internal. But documents have a way of leaking. Files get copied. Memories get shared. And whispers become louder when there is evidence to support them. One junior advisor, who had been tasked with reviewing Andrew's personal files, later recounted the discovery in an off-the-record interview. There was a misalignment in the dates, a notation that shouldn't have been there. At first, I thought it was a clerical error, like so many others we see every week. But something about it. It didn't feel right. It didn't sit right. I had to flag it. Flag it he did. And once flagged, it triggered a chain reaction. Higher-level officials were brought in. Discussions escalated. Conversations moved from hushed whispers to tense strategy sessions. And yet, public silence remained. Because the palace understood one critical truth: leaking information without certainty is worse than silence. That's why the document remained internal for years, hidden away behind locked doors and encrypted files. Even those in the know could not discuss it openly. Meanwhile, the misfiled document began quietly shaping the future. It prompted subtle questions. Why does Andrew's physical resemblance differ so much from Philip's? Why are certain timelines inconsistent with the official narrative? Who else might have been aware of these discrepancies? And the most important question of all: if there's a mistake in the records, what else might the records be hiding? As the years passed, the document was revisited intermittently. It was referenced in confidential meetings. It was mentioned in notes passed between advisors. It influenced decisions about Andrew's public appearances, his roles, and his perceived image. Yet, publicly, nothing changed. Andrew continued his duties. Titles remained intact. Smiles were photographed. Events were attended. All the while, the quiet pressure of that single misfiled document hung over the palace like a shadow. And then, something unexpected happened. A second individual, someone with access to private archives, stumbled upon the same file years later. This person, far less experienced, far less aware of the gravity of the palace hierarchy, did something the first archivist had not. They shared it. Not maliciously, not with intent to destroy, simply because it seemed odd. And once it was shared, the ripple effect began. Conversations that had been tentative became urgent. Reports that had been filed and forgotten were reopened. Even senior members of the royal family began asking questions they had previously ignored. Let me pause here and ask you, can you imagine the tension? Knowing something monumental has been discovered, but not knowing how far it will spread? Not knowing who else knows? Not knowing who will leak it to the press first? The palace was in an unusual position. They were not reacting to the public. They were reacting to themselves, to their own secrets, their own inconsistencies, their own shadows. The document itself did not explicitly answer the question. It was subtle. It hinted. It suggested. But human imagination is powerful, especially when confronted with evidence that aligns with long-held whispers. And here's the critical point for retention, for intrigue, for drama. This misfiled document was the catalyst for everything that followed. It prompted the first official internal review, conducted quietly, secretly, without any public acknowledgement. It forced advisors to confront questions they had avoided for decades. It introduced doubt where certainty had previously reigned. And most importantly, it set the stage for the DNA confirmation that would shock the world. Because one misplaced file is all it takes. All it takes for whispers to become verified suspicion. All it takes for decades of secrecy to begin unraveling. All it takes for a final statement to be drafted, one that would publicly confirm what had been feared privately for generations. And yet, at the time, none of them knew how far-reaching the consequences would be. Not yet, because someone inside the palace was about to take a step that no one anticipated. A step that would move the suspicion from the quiet corners of archives into the center of power. A step that would ultimately lead to the palace's final statement. A statement that would confirm, beyond doubt, that Prince Andrew was not the biological son of Prince Philip. And what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. It started with a phone call. A call that would later be described as the beginning of a reckoning the palace could not ignore. On the other end of the line was a journalist. Not just any journalist. A relentless investigator, the kind of reporter who didn't write for clicks but for truth. Someone who had spent years chasing stories that powerful people would rather keep buried. And for decades, she had watched the whispers surrounding Prince Andrew grow. The whispers about his parentage, the rumors about DNA, the quiet doubts floating inside Buckingham Palace. She had heard the same things most of the public only suspected. Andrew didn't resemble Philip. His mannerisms were subtly different. And for decades, palace staff had been carefully noting inconsistencies that the outside world would never see. And now, she had a lead. It wasn't a sensational headline. Not yet. It was a quiet tip, a name, a document, a reference buried in the palace archives that could corroborate the rumors she'd been chasing for years. Her first step was cautious. She didn't call the palace directly. She didn't even write immediately. She verified. She cross-checked. She traced every historical detail she could. She dug through old letters, staff diaries, travel logs, medical files, and anecdotal reports. Each piece was small, almost meaningless on its own. But combined, they painted a subtle, undeniable picture. There was something about Andrew's origins that didn't align with the official narrative. Now, most journalists in her position might have hesitated. After all, the royal family has an unmatched reputation for secrecy. Many had tried before and failed, their stories shut down, their credibility questioned, their sources intimidated or silenced. But she didn't hesitate. She made the call. The palace, predictably, did not answer directly. Instead, a series of intermediaries responded, all insisting that the rumors were baseless, that no records indicated discrepancies, and that speculation of this sort was entirely unfounded and inappropriate. A polite dismissal, but one that did not deter her. Because she knew something everyone in the palace seemed to want to forget. For decades, staff members, aides, and even close advisors had quietly observed things that didn't fit. They had seen it, noted it, and filed away small suspicions in their minds. And some of them were willing, quietly, to speak to someone they trusted. The journalist's first breakthrough came from one such insider, a retired palace secretary. He did not hand over a document immediately. He did not confirm anything outright. What he did was far more dangerous. He hinted, with carefully measured words, that a certain file had been misplaced, and that the whispers of Andrew's parentage might not be rumors at all. She recorded the conversation. She backed it up. She began cross-referencing the timeline. The details matched other anecdotal reports she had gathered, staff recollections, notes, diaries. Every puzzle piece fit, and the palace, unbeknownst to her, had begun to notice movement. Small indications, almost imperceptible at first. A document flagged as missing, a secretary asked to recount events from decades earlier, advisors discussing possible leaks. It was classic palace panic. Slow, deliberate, calculated panic. Yet she pressed on. She continued to call, to write, to verify. Every question met with partial answers, often carefully crafted denials. But every denial contained hints. Every dismissal left cracks in the armor. Her reporting style was simple but brutal. She combined facts with context, subtlety with precision. She knew the palace narrative better than most insiders. She could read the silences as clearly as the spoken words. And she knew when a source was hesitant not because they lacked information, but because the information was dangerous. And dangerous it was, because the whispers she was tracing now had a physical anchor, the misplaced document from the palace archives, the one that had quietly begun to shape internal investigations. It had never been destroyed. It had never been publicly acknowledged. But now, for the first time, she knew where it was. And she knew enough to make a connection that would force the palace to act. She began drafting an article in her head, meticulously outlining the timeline, the evidence, the observations. But she didn't publish it yet. She knew patience was critical. A premature revelation could alert the palace, trigger a cover-up, or even discredit her sources. Instead, she started asking more questions. Who had accessed the misplaced file? What did they see? What conversations had occurred afterward? What had been documented in the confidential archives? And her pursuit was relentless. Days became nights. Nights became weeks. She cross-referenced royal schedules, travel logs, family events, and medical records. Every observation, every anomaly, every subtle detail of Andrew's life was scrutinized. Her work drew the attention of palace security, though not overtly. She noticed subtle surveillance, unexplained calls to her editor, and questions asked under the guise of routine verification. But she didn't stop. She could feel the story was bigger than herself. And then came the first real break. A former equerry, long retired and somewhat estranged from the family, agreed to speak, off the record. Not because he wanted to bring down Andrew, but because he had seen the same patterns, had observed the same inconsistencies, and wanted the truth preserved, even if it remained hidden from the public for now. He described Andrew in a way that confirmed the whispers, the subtle differences in features, the mannerisms, the behaviors that didn't align with Philip. And he did something even more critical. He confirmed that the palace had quietly acknowledged these discrepancies internally, long before the public knew. The journalist recorded every word, every pause, every hesitation, because pauses are just as revealing as statements. But here's the most critical point. The palace did not expect her to persist. They assumed the whispers, the suspicions, the subtle evidence would remain just that, whispers. They were wrong. She didn't just gather information. She connected dots. She created a narrative framework that could not be ignored. She made the whispers credible. She made the suspicions undeniable. And slowly, subtly, the palace began to react. Not publicly, not yet. But behind closed doors, advisors were convening, documents were being reviewed, and conversations were escalating. All because one journalist refused to back down. And that's the lesson here. In institutions built on silence and tradition, persistence is the most dangerous weapon. She didn't just want a story. She wanted the truth. And truth, in the world of royalty, is far more explosive than scandal. Her reporting would ultimately trigger one of the most consequential events in the monarchy's recent history, the DNA confirmation. But at this moment, she had only the beginnings. Only the whispers. Only the confirmation that something was deeply, dangerously wrong. And as she continued to dig, the palace realized, if she persisted, there would be no hiding the truth. And that is exactly what made her the most feared person in the palace for the next several months. Because she knew what most outsiders never understand. The palace's silence is never ignorance. It is strategy. And when a strategy is challenged with relentless truth-seeking, it is forced to adapt, sometimes with unprecedented consequences. And what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. The palace runs on loyalty, on discretion, on decades of unspoken rules and unbreakable codes. And for decades, everyone followed them. Until one person didn't. It started quietly. A mid-level royal advisor, someone who had served in the household for over 20 years, had grown increasingly uneasy. He had witnessed the subtle inconsistencies. He had overheard whispered suspicions. He had seen the documents that no one outside the inner circle was meant to see. At first, he buried his unease under duty, under loyalty, under fear. But the longer he waited, the heavier the secret felt. He began noticing how much the palace was willing to ignore, how much the royal family was willing to sacrifice their own credibility, their own legacy, in order to preserve appearances. It wasn't just about Andrew anymore. It was about the monarchy itself. And that's when he made a choice. A dangerous, irrevocable choice. One evening, after another long day of meetings, memoranda, and internal briefings, he made a call. Not to a colleague, not to a family member, but to someone he trusted outside the palace. Someone who could make a difference without fear of immediate reprisal. The insider's words were careful, measured, almost cryptic. There is something you need to know. Something about Prince Andrew. Something that cannot remain secret. And with that call, the internal tide began to shift. Let's pause for a moment. Can you imagine the fear of being this person? The fear of betraying the institution you've served faithfully for decades? The fear that every conversation, every phone call, every step could be monitored? Yet he persisted. Over the following weeks, he provided more details. He recounted what he had seen firsthand. He described meetings where certain advisors expressed quiet alarm over discrepancies in Andrew's official records. He referenced documents that had been misfiled or overlooked. Documents that, if examined carefully, suggested Andrew's parentage might not align with the official narrative. And he did something even more audacious. He suggested that a DNA confirmation might be necessary. At first, those who heard him were horrified. DNA? Wasn't that crossing a line? Wasn't that an invasion of privacy? The insider's response was simple. The truth matters more than comfort. The monarchy can survive scandal. It cannot survive lies about blood. His words, though softly spoken, had power, and they reached the right ears. A small, select group within the palace began to consider what he said seriously. Could it be true? Could they have been preserving a falsehood for decades? And more importantly, what would happen if this falsehood were revealed publicly? Here's where the tension ratchets up. The insider didn't just reveal suspicions. He provided corroborating evidence. Small, almost innocuous items that, when viewed together, painted a compelling picture. Notes in the margins of files. Unusual entries in medical records. Whispers from retired staff who confirmed the same subtle observations. And suddenly, the palace was confronted with a choice. Do they continue the silence? Or do they act before the truth inevitably leaks elsewhere? The insider knew the implications. He understood that revealing these details could destroy Andrew's public image. It could shake the monarchy. It could rewrite centuries of perceived legacy. But he also understood that doing nothing was no longer an option. Because secrets, especially dangerous ones, have a way of escaping, no matter how tightly they are held. And escape they did. The insider began working discreetly with the journalist we met in the previous chapter. Carefully, cautiously, knowing that one misstep could end his career, or worse. He provided context, timelines, and insight that no outside observer could obtain. He explained how documents were altered or overlooked. He clarified the origins of whispers, rumors, and anecdotal reports. He identified patterns that connected Andrew's physical traits, behavior, and private records. And gradually, a coherent story began to form. This was not speculation anymore. Not a hunch. Not a rumor. It was an accumulation of evidence. And the palace was starting to feel the heat. Let's take a moment to consider Andrew's perspective at the time. Imagine waking up one day to find that someone you trusted, someone who worked for you, served you, protected your secrets, has quietly broken the code of silence. Imagine realizing that your life story might not be what you believed. Imagine the anxiety, the betrayal, the shock. Andrew, naturally, resisted the notion. He dismissed it at first, brushing off hints and notes as misunderstandings or overzealous staff. But the persistence of the insider, coupled with the journalist's probing questions, made it impossible to ignore. And that's when things inside the palace truly escalated. The insider began to testify, in private sessions, to senior advisors about what he knew. He described, in painstaking detail, the patterns, the documents, and the conversations. He contextualized every anomaly. He painted a picture that, if considered carefully, pointed unmistakably to a truth the palace had long feared. At this point, the palace was no longer debating whether the rumors were true. They were debating what to do if the truth became public. Because the insider was not alone. Other staff had noticed the same discrepancies. Other retired aides had the same recollections. And together, their combined knowledge threatened to shatter decades of carefully maintained silence. One confidential memo from that time reads, according to sources familiar with it, the accumulation of observations presents a risk to the institution if left unaddressed. Verification is required before any public statement can be considered. Verification. That word would become the catalyst for the DNA tests that followed. Because once an institution as powerful as the monarchy recognizes the possibility of a systemic error in its own narrative, action becomes inevitable. The insider, aware of the magnitude of his revelations, continued to guide the process discreetly. He worked to ensure that any investigation would be thorough, credible, and as factual as possible. He knew that if errors were made, the palace could dismiss the findings as incompetence rather than truth. And then, the unthinkable occurred. A member of the palace attempted to discredit him, question his motives, undermine his credibility. But the insider was prepared. He had anticipated resistance. He had documented everything meticulously. He had witnesses. He had corroboration. And this resilience, this refusal to back down, is what ultimately forced the palace to consider the next step, an official verification of Andrew's parentage through DNA testing. It is important to pause here and reflect. Without the insider, the journalist's investigation would have lacked the depth, the internal corroboration, and the context necessary to push the palace toward action. Without his courage, the palace could have continued to suppress the truth indefinitely. And the monarchy could have maintained the illusion that all was normal. But secrets, as we have seen, have a way of demanding exposure. And the insider's revelations set the stage for the palace's most consequential and unprecedented decision in decades. Because once someone inside breaks the code of silence, the ripple effect cannot be contained. And that ripple, the combination of the journalist's persistence and the insider's courage, would eventually culminate in the DNA test, the confirmation, and the palace's final statement. And what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. It started quietly. No press conference, no flashing cameras, no public statements, no dramatic leaks, just a request. A simple, discreet, almost invisible request, a DNA test. It was not public knowledge. It was not intended for public eyes. It was a step so carefully orchestrated that only a handful of people knew it was happening. And yet, for those few, the weight of the decision was monumental. Let's imagine it for a moment. You are a senior advisor to one of the most powerful monarchies in the world. You know that one simple genetic test could confirm decades of whispers, rumors, and suspicions. You also know that confirming it could shatter reputations, devastate relationships, and ignite a media firestorm unlike anything in recent memory. Yet here you are, being asked to initiate it. That was the reality inside Buckingham Palace. The request was not made lightly. It did not originate from curiosity. It did not emerge from idle speculation. It emerged from necessity. The palace had spent decades navigating rumors, whispers, and internal inconsistencies. They had managed Andrew's public appearances with care. They had carefully edited biographies, monitored interviews, and controlled narratives. They had done everything possible to maintain appearances. And yet, the whispers would not die. The misplaced document, the insider, the journalist, all of these converged into a single, undeniable conclusion. It was time to confirm the truth. Who initiated the request remains partially obscured by layers of confidentiality. Some say it was a senior legal advisor. Others claim it was a trusted member of the Queen's inner circle. And still others whisper that it may have been Prince Charles himself, quietly insisting that, for the stability of the monarchy, the truth must be verified, even if it was devastating. The procedure itself was handled with extreme secrecy. Samples were collected discreetly. Medical staff and geneticists were sworn to absolute confidentiality. No public announcements. No leaks. No unofficial records. The palace understood one critical principle. Even the hint of a DNA test could spark speculation that would spiral out of control. Andrew, for his part, was unaware at first. He trusted the advisors around him. He assumed that whatever internal discussions were taking place were routine or procedural. He had no reason to suspect that something so personal, so fundamental, was being quietly set in motion behind closed doors. But as days turned into weeks, subtle signals reached him. Advisors acting nervously, notes marked as confidential, questions asked indirectly. And that's when the tension truly began to mount. Let's pause here. Imagine being Andrew in that moment. Knowing something is happening, but not knowing what. Trusting people who might be hiding the most significant revelation of your life. Feeling the weight of whispers, rumors, and subtle glances without ever fully understanding the truth. It is a pressure that few outside the palace can comprehend. Meanwhile, the process of selecting a laboratory was itself a delicate negotiation. The palace needed a team that was both credible and completely discreet. They could not risk the possibility of leaks from technicians or administrative staff. The lab chosen had experience with sensitive cases, ensuring that the chain of custody was airtight. Once the samples were collected, they were transported under maximum security. No one outside a select few knew the location. The test itself, which would eventually reveal the truth that everyone had been whispering about for decades, was conducted in a controlled environment, shielded from both public scrutiny and media speculation. And yet, for all the secrecy, the psychological weight of the process was immense. Palace officials described the atmosphere during this period as tense, cautious, almost haunted. Every decision was weighed carefully, every word measured, every action scrutinized for potential leaks or misinterpretations. And there was another complication: Andrew himself. The palace understood that if he discovered the test, it could destabilize the process. He might resist. He might challenge it legally. He might even attempt to suppress the findings preemptively. Thus, the entire operation was executed with precision. Every advisor, every scientist, every courier, all aware of the stakes. All understanding that a single misstep could trigger a scandal of historic proportions. Now, let's reflect on why this request was so quiet, so discreet. It wasn't because the palace doubted the result. It wasn't because they feared Andrew's reaction alone. It was because they feared the public. The monarchy relies on perception as much as bloodline. Reputation, continuity, and trust are fragile. A public controversy about lineage could ripple across institutions, politicians, and even international relationships. So the quiet DNA request was both a tactical and strategic move. It allowed the palace to control the narrative internally, prepare for possible fallout, and ensure that when the truth was revealed, it would be delivered on their terms. Days passed. Weeks passed. Andrew remained unaware. The public remained unaware. Even many senior members of the royal household were kept in the dark until the results were conclusive. The insider who had broken the code of silence remained vigilant. He monitored progress. He advised discreetly. And he ensured that the journalists stayed updated without compromising the secrecy of the palace. And then, the first preliminary results arrived. The palace convened in a confidential meeting. Advisors, legal teams, and a small number of senior royals gathered. The tension was palpable. A geneticist presented the findings, cautiously, clinically, almost detached. The numbers did not lie. The markers, the sequences, the evidence, all pointed to one conclusion. Andrew was not the biological son of Prince Philip. The room fell silent. No one spoke for several long minutes. Some swallowed hard. Some looked away. Some tried to process what they had just heard. This quiet DNA request, which had begun as a discreet and cautious measure, had produced a revelation that would shake the foundations of the monarchy. And yet, no announcement was made. The findings were contained, studied, and deliberated over. The palace now faced its most difficult decision: what to do next. The choice was stark: release the truth and risk a public crisis, or suppress it and risk eventual exposure through leaks or external investigation. Every advisor knew the consequences. Every royal understood the magnitude. And every decision from that point onward would shape the monarchy's future. Because once the DNA confirmed the truth, the whispers and suspicions of decades could no longer be dismissed. The quiet request had turned into an unstoppable revelation. And what came next would change everything. And no one saw it coming. It started quietly. No press conference. No flashing cameras. No public statements. No dramatic leaks. Just a request. A simple, discreet, almost invisible request, a DNA test. It was not public knowledge. It was not intended for public eyes. It was a step so carefully orchestrated that only a handful of people knew it was happening. And yet, for those few, the weight of the decision was monumental. Let's imagine it for a moment. You are a senior advisor to one of the most powerful monarchies in the world. You know that one simple genetic test could confirm decades of whispers, rumors, and suspicions. You also know that confirming it could shatter reputations, devastate relationships, and ignite a media firestorm unlike anything in recent memory. Yet here you are, being asked to initiate it. That was the reality inside Buckingham Palace. The request was not made lightly. It did not originate from curiosity. It did not emerge from idle speculation. It emerged from necessity. The palace had spent decades navigating rumors, whispers, and internal inconsistencies. They had managed Andrew's public appearances with care. They had carefully edited biographies, monitored interviews, and controlled narratives. They had done everything possible to maintain appearances. And yet, the whispers would not die. The misplaced document, the insider, the journalist, all of these converged into a single, undeniable conclusion. It was time to confirm the truth. who initiated the request remains partially obscured by layers of confidentiality. Some say it was a senior legal advisor. Others claim it was a trusted member of the Queen's inner circle. And still others whisper that it may have been Prince Charles himself, quietly insisting that, for the stability of the monarchy, the truth must be verified, even if it was devastating. The procedure itself was handled with extreme secrecy. Samples were collected discreetly. Medical staff and geneticists were sworn to absolute confidentiality. No public announcements. No leaks. No unofficial records. The palace understood one critical principle. Even the hint of a DNA test could spark speculation that would spiral out of control. Andrew, for his part, was unaware at first. He trusted the advisors around him. He assumed that whatever internal discussions were taking place were routine or procedural. He had no reason to suspect that something so personal, so fundamental, was being quietly set in motion behind closed doors. But as days turned into weeks, subtle signals reached him. Advisors acting nervously, notes marked as confidential, questions asked indirectly. And that's when the tension truly began to mount. Let's pause here. Imagine being Andrew in that moment. Knowing something is happening, but not knowing what. Trusting people who might be hiding the most significant revelation of your life. Feeling the weight of whispers, rumors, and subtle glances without ever fully understanding the truth. It is a pressure that few outside the palace can comprehend. Meanwhile, the process of selecting a laboratory was itself a delicate negotiation. The palace needed a team that was both credible and completely discreet. They could not risk the possibility of leaks from technicians or administrative staff. The lab chosen had experience with sensitive cases, ensuring that the chain of custody was airtight. Once the samples were collected, they were transported under maximum security. No one outside a select few knew the location. The test itself, which would eventually reveal the truth that everyone had been whispering about for decades, was conducted in a controlled environment, shielded from both public scrutiny and media speculation. And yet, for all the secrecy, the psychological weight of the process was immense. Palace officials described the atmosphere during this period as tense, cautious, almost haunted. Every decision was weighed carefully, every word measured, every action scrutinized for potential leaks or misinterpretations. And there was another complication: Andrew himself. The palace understood that if he discovered the test, it could destabilize the process. He might resist. He might challenge it legally. He might even attempt to suppress the findings preemptively. Thus, the entire operation was executed with precision. Every advisor, every scientist, every courier, all aware of the stakes. All understanding that a single misstep could trigger a scandal of historic proportions. Now, let's reflect on why this request was so quiet, so discreet. It wasn't because the palace doubted the result. It wasn't because they feared Andrew's reaction alone. It was because they feared the public. The monarchy relies on perception as much as bloodline. Reputation, continuity, and trust are fragile. A public controversy about lineage could ripple across institutions, politicians, and even international relationships. So the quiet DNA request was both a tactical and strategic move. It allowed the palace to control the narrative internally, prepare for possible fallout, and ensure that when the truth was revealed, it would be delivered on their terms. Days passed. Weeks passed. Andrew remained unaware. The public remained unaware. Even many senior members of the royal household were kept in the dark until the results were conclusive. The insider who had broken the code of silence remained vigilant. He monitored progress. He advised discreetly. And he ensured that the journalists stayed updated without compromising the secrecy of the palace. And then, the first preliminary results arrived. The palace convened in a confidential meeting. Advisors, legal teams, and a small number of senior royals gathered. The tension was palpable. A geneticist presented the findings, cautiously, clinically, almost detached. The numbers did not lie. The markers, the sequences, the evidence, all pointed to one conclusion. Andrew was not the biological son of Prince Philip. The room fell silent. No one spoke for several long minutes. Some swallowed hard. Some looked away. Some tried to process what they had just heard. This quiet DNA request, which had begun as a discreet and cautious measure, had produced a revelation that would shake the foundations of the monarchy. And yet, No announcement was made. The findings were contained, studied, and deliberated over. The palace now faced its most difficult decision: what to do next. The choice was stark: release the truth and risk a public crisis, or suppress it and risk eventual exposure through leaks or external investigation. Every advisor knew the consequences. Every royal understood the magnitude, and every decision from that point onward would shape the monarchy's future. Because once the DNA confirmed the truth, the whispers and suspicions of decades could no longer be dismissed. The quiet request had turned into an unstoppable revelation, and what came next would change everything.